Yo, what happened? Well, think about what's going on. If we were so, firstly, what are some terms that you felt were difficult? Which ones you felt were difficult that you don't remember as well, that you feel like you need to like get a refresher on? Which one? Peace with honor. Peace with honor. Okay. Now, so peace with honor essentially is tied to Vietnam. Okay. The whole peace with honor concept is we need to leave Vietnam with honor. Right. Remember, this is led under which president? Do you remember? Nixon. Right. Nixon was the president that was championing this concept of peace with honor, because his whole concept was, because of how embarrassing Vietnam was as a whole, because of the fact that we were not winning, we were constantly losing resources, losing wealth, and nationally looked embarrassing when it comes to like not gaining anything from this. His idea was we need to leave out of this situation with our honor intact. So what he was trying to do was negotiate his way out and slowly but surely take troops out of the war, out of Vietnam as a whole, but also try to come away with this and say, we are leaving with our heads held high and all that stuff. Like at the end of the day, it really was not a peaceful, leaving either, but it was like his method of, and a lot of people appeal to this because he just wanted out, right? And I think the biggest thing is for this, it's a lot of it has to do with Vietnam, and I would definitely talk about like the background of like what's going on in Vietnam, why people were so upset. I think a lot of it has to do with the things you can mention here would be things like the credibility gap, right? Talk about how under LBJ, he was the government was saying stuff that we were doing well, but in reality we weren't. Like we were struggling. We could not advance much as we wanted to. There was brutality going on often, and the news media was showing that. They were filming it in front of the national audiences, and so people were tired of war, right? You saw the rise of the counterculture movement, like the hippie movement, right? So all that stuff culminates in leaving out of Vietnam, right? But the point was that they wanted to leave with their honor intact. That's what he was really emphasizing. Sure. So let's talk about first the rise of conservatism. Okay. Now, this is the last thing we learned about for Unity. Okay. And we had the activity on rise of conservatism, but basically it was a culmination of basically how we saw the start of the new left, right? Under Robert Kennedy, he was kind of like the champion of the new left, which was JFK's brother. But basically the new left was a younger grouping of more liberal thinking people from colleges that were more intertwined in politics, and they wanted to have more government intervention or government money that was being paid into like basic programs. And because of things like constant protests we saw from the 60s and the 70s, there was now kind of a feeling within the country that they don't want to constantly see kind of these protests and government spending, because you have to think about it in the context of things like Great Society, right, under LBJ, the Vietnam War being a kind of a hub of just spending money and nothing really accomplishing from it, and constant protests from the hippie movement and other groups. Like there was movements that go against environmental protections about like we should get rid of nuclear power because it's causing a lot of issues with the environment. A lot of people were protesting a lot of different components. So this rise of conservatism is the feeling of we need to go opposite direction of what the country was going in. We need to go less government spending. We need to kind of crack down on the mass protests that were going on, which is like that concepts of like law and order that a lot of people were emphasizing with Ronald Reagan. A lot of those feelings of saying we need to just be winning again. Because if you really think about it, right before Reagan is elected, we have issues with Carter, right? Carter is not really accomplishing much of what he was intending to do. Government spending was up, but we still have a kind of an embarrassing moment with the Iran hostage crisis, right? And that is something that was shown to be like a very bad mark on Carter. And all the people were saying we're always losing, we're spending too much money, and we need to cut back on all that stuff. And that's what causes more people in the country to be more kind of becoming more conservative in their values rather than becoming more liberal with their values, like which is like what Kennedy and LBJ were, and even Carter were trying to do, was be more about government involved, things like that, more showing your discontent for what's going on. So that's what the rise of conservatism is, and it culminates with Ronald Reagan being the president by winning by like a landslide victory. Okay. And the other one was a populist. I know I walked around and I saw a lot of people had difficulties with the populist party. Was that a common issue? Yeah. Okay. So what were they? So the populist party was kind of a collection of a few different groups. Okay. It starts out with it's kind of growing during this Gilded Age. Okay. The populist party basically was first off a collection of farmers' alliances. During the time of the Gilded Age, where there's not really much government intervention in the economy at all, it was laissez-faire economics, which meant that the railroad industry they could have monopolies like we saw with other people like Vanderbilt and Jay Gould had controlled all these different railroad tracks during this time. And the people who were struggling the most were farmers when it comes to competition of trying to get access to these different railroads. So they started to say, well, we need to have better treatment. We need to have crackdown on tariffs. So we want to form our own unions, which were farmers' alliances. Enough of these farmers' alliances formed together with the support of people like with the kind of rise of workers' rights groups and labor unions to form populist party. The populist party is a collection of it's like a workers' party. Okay, it's a party made up of people that want to improve the rights and working conditions of workers. And you might ask, well, what's the difference between a populist party and the progressive party? Right, they're two different eras. They might be similar in like their fight for the average person, but they are different in a time period and what exactly they're trying to accomplish. Like, for example, populist party was looking to benefit the worker, whether that's the farmer, whether that's the factory worker. They were promoting concepts like minimum wage, like minimum a limitation on working hours that can be forced upon a worker, direct election of senators, a graduated income tax, right? These were all things that the Populist Party was promoting because their mindset was that they need to crack down on the super wealthy and start giving rights back to the average American, right? Because remember, during the Gilded Age, there were problems with things like political bosses, right? The people in local states or local towns that had complete control over the voting systems, and they were tied to the wealthy. So the wealthy could say, hey, I will invest so much money in you if you get certain things passed in your state and the problem or state or for the Senate. And they felt as if, well, to combat that, instead of having senators picked originally by the local, like the state officials, you should have them picked directly by the people themselves so that it avoids that possible corruption that is going on in the Gilded Age. Now, granted, the Populist Party never wins an election, but one thing they do accomplish is a lot of the policies that they promoted eventually are taken up by the Democratic Party, which is going to be obviously like when you think about William Jennings Bryan, he's a person that had the famous speech, the Heart of the Cross of Gold speech, which is basically he was the proponent of saying we should change our money system to instead be about gold standard, right? To be now a bimetal standard. It's inclusion of silver and gold, which then increases the money supply in the country. Yes.
Farmers prefer this.
Yeah, farmers prefer the silver and gold method because it does cause inflation to happen. Because think about it, silver is a lot easier to come by than gold. So the more silver you find, that could change the amount of money, like the money supply, as you find more silver, right? So that means that the money currency rate can change, which means inflation can happen. Now, you might say the word inflation is a bad word, but natural inflation occurs all the time. But in their mindset, it's better to have more money in the pot so that people can have money to spend and pay back over time versus a limited amount of money for everybody to have, so that farmers might not have any bills to actually, they can't have any money in their pockets to pay anything back at all. So that's really the mindset. So it's Populist Party, just keep that in mind. It's like a workers' party. Okay, it's a workers' party that happened before the progressive era. Yes, go ahead, Phil.
Unit 8, the containment and dominant theory, like how the Vietnam War and everything, was that part of like the Red Scare thing?
Yeah, so remember, Unit 8 essentially starts with post World War II and the era of just think of Cold War right off the bat, right? And so containment, like you said, containment, dominant theory are very much similar in their mindsets and what they're doing. What's easy about Unit 8 is that almost every president during that time is finding ways to combat communism. It's just a different flavor depending on the president you have. Like Truman, it was a champion of containment. He was the one that enacted that. So if you're talking about containment, think about like the Marshall Plan, right? Think about like different plans that they put forward to invest money into countries to help them stay stable enough that they don't have to turn to communism as a method of saving themselves. Right, domino theory was just an expansion upon containment by Eisenhower. Eisenhower just says, well, his fear is that if one country within a region falls to communism, the fear is that that country then can turn every other country around them into communism. So he was a proponent of thinking about Vietnam, right? Even though he wasn't the president when Vietnam all happened, he was kind of the president that built up the military and plans for what would happen with Vietnam, or even think about with Castro. He was the one that was proposing, like creating plans for eventual, attempt to overthrowing Castro because of his fears of the same thing. He thought that if one country like Vietnam falls, then you have Laos, you have Cambodia, will all fall to communism. So that's how they build together. Like they're both the same in the same umbrella. It's a combating of communism. It's just different ideologies or concepts going along with that same thing. All right. Any other terms? Any other terms that were a struggle that you want to talk about? Yeah, it's good. Great Society. Okay, so Great Society. Does anyone here know Great Society? I mean, you probably have heard of it. Obviously, you should know what it is. But Great Society, okay, if you're making a comparison to what programs would you make a comparison to the Great Society? If you're gonna make, if it helps you understand it, what's the similarity? Go ahead, Zoe. The New Deal. Okay. Now the only difference is about the president and the time that it was proposed. Okay. Similar circumstances, but not even like the New Deal was proposed during the Great Depression. Okay, because of how bad the economy and the unemployment rate was. Basically, the New Deal was to invest, like the government to invest in programs to create a safety net for people, but to also try to open up jobs for others to, like, they would invest in infrastructure so that people can start working again for building roads and buildings and fixing bridges and stuff like that. But it was also a safety net so that people who are struggling, it was almost like the government's going to pick up the tab for you. So that if you need some medical assistance, the government can help you out there. You need some like money because you're unemployed, the government can help you out there. The Great Society is a mirroring of the New Deal, right? It was a similar goal. The government would step up and start helping and creating policies to help people who are struggling, because during LBJ's presidency, poverty rate was pretty high. So he started that war on poverty. That was like his main domestic policy goal. So Great Society does a lot of things. Think about like Social Security, think about Medicare, Medicaid, like that stuff was all proposed in the Great Society. A lot of policies of like opening up jobs for people, like it's a re-immersion of that New Deal policy. Now there's a whole lot of reforms that are listed. I think on the PowerPoint I give like a whole list of them for you. There's a lot there, a lot of different programs. Other terms. Yeah. Which one? Okay. So Roaring 20s. Okay. Now, Roaring 20s. When you think about Roaring 20s, what are some things that you should keep in mind? Yeah, go ahead, Anderson. Think about well, during that time, Harlem Renaissance. Okay. Well, if you think about things going on before, what leads to the Roaring 20s? The war, right? World War I. World War I ends. So that means that, remember, that whole mindset of how, you know, when people are going to war, they have to pay for, I mean, everyone's leaving to go to war. So that means there's a wave of jobs that were filled in, right? We talked about how basically during that time, women and African Americans had gained more jobs than they probably have ever had. And so all of a sudden, when those soldiers had to return back home, the first like year and a half, there was that like mini recession that happened because people were struggling to like find jobs. But once everything stabilized, all of a sudden, you know, they started producing more consumer-based goods. Everyone started having jobs. Everyone started having wealth. And so this results in an era, roughly a decade of just prosperity, right? All the way to 29. So not a decade, but like roughly 9-ish years of prosperity. People had jobs. They were buying more goods than they've ever had. They went out more. People were starting to just enjoy life because they just been through a war, and there's increased nationalism abroad, right? Specifically in the United States. And that leads to that era of prosperity and cultural expansion, which is what the Roaring 20s is. You saw the flapper movement where women were challenging the norms of society of that time. You saw a lot of just depictions of what culture should be, and that Roaring 20s is the emphasis of that. Okay. Any others? Yeah, go ahead, Connor. Imperialism? We didn't talk about it yet, but okay. So imperialism. Now remember, imperialism is a pretty big topic. Okay. I think honestly, I don't want to guess. I don't want to suggest or make a long shot assumption, but I could be wrong. But I think they might give a question on imperialism for the AP because they haven't had a big DBQ or a big LEQ question on imperialism for like roughly 2-3 years. And I could think imperialism might be it's actually a pretty good DBQ topic. because it's talking a lot about the United States involvement abroad in other nations, and you can talk a lot about the impact of that, whether it's the impact abroad or impact internally within the country. So a lot of things that you can say here would be how the United States was kind of like reemerging as an economic superpower at this point. They basically were already growing as a nation with industrialization and wealth that they had as a country, and advancement of their navy was already growing at this point. Now, the fact is, you can connect imperialism to a concept like manifest destiny, because imperialism is like a manifest destiny 2.0. I use that as an example because a lot of historians will make that connection. If manifest destiny is the God-given right to expand westward to the Pacific Ocean, imperialism is to expand yourself all the way to abroad into other nations as a means of influence and connection, right? So we were basically trying to connect ourselves or compete with a lot of other nations that were doing this already, right? The European powers were already well ahead of us in imperialism. So we were looking at this as a situation of, do we not conduct imperialism to be like left behind, or do we compete and continually do this? And a lot of the policies you see here, like for example, imperialism and the big stick policy kind of go hand in hand, right? Imperialism is the mindset of expansion of United States colonialism into more areas. Along those lines, right, guys, along those lines, okay, imperialism also connects to us. How do we change our foreign policy along the way? And that's what the big stick policy and other ideas of like Roosevelt Colliery all go along with that, right? Because it's basically how we change the way we thought about foreign policy decision making from here on out. Okay, so imperialism is a lot of things you can say with that, and I think it's a good topic of essay writing, to be honest with you. Okay, yeah, good. Go ahead, Roland. Sure. So big stick policy. So think about up to this point. Okay, a good question to always think about is foreign policy in the United States. How does it change over time? I think that was one of the questions that I had asked you. I think whether it was a written like BBQ or LEQ, I think one of those two, I think I asked you. Think about the United States was always neutral, right? And the fact is, when Monroe had put forward his Monroe Doctrine, he basically said that we are defending the Western Hemisphere compared to like if European nations arrive. That's going to be our goal, to defend the Western Hemisphere and kick out any European powers that might step into our business. And so when the progressive era begins and the start of the 1900s begins, Teddy Roosevelt steps in as president, obviously after McKinley gets killed. And so when he steps in, the United States has a very powerful Navy, where we call it, the nickname of it was the Great White Fleet, because it was painted white on the sidings and everything. But when we have this massive military and this Navy, Roosevelt wants to use it. So what he does is, the big stick policy is his method of dealing with problems happening in the Western Hemisphere, right? It was also his method of dealing with problems close to any colonies that we might have. So for example, when you think about like what was going on with Venezuela, okay, one example that he does is Venezuela, as well as one nation I'm forgetting top of my head, but Venezuela. So Venezuela owed money to nations like Germany and to Britain, okay? And they were looking to get the money back from what they were originally supposed to get paid for. We step in and say, no, we will be the tax collectors for you. And what we do is we station our military right outside of Venezuela, and we say, are you going to pay your bills or not? And they say, we'll pay the bill, because they know they cannot stand even close to what the Navy can do. So the big stick policy kind of is that the idea of using your military as a deterrent to force people to do the specific things, whether it's to force them to do something specific or to force them to meet to the table, right? Another example of that would be like the Russo-Japanese War, okay? The war between Russia and Japan was escalating. Japan was dominating pretty much. And so because of the fact that they were competing for a lot of colonies, and one of them was roughly right near our Pacific-based colonies, Roosevelt stepped up and he said, he used his Navy, he says, we're going to stop this war right now. If you have a problem with that, then you can talk to me about it. And they both stopped and they had a negotiation and ended the war. So that's just an example. Use your military as a deterrent to stop people or scare them into submission to then negotiate. Now he does this pretty well. Other presidents will attempt to do it this way and not go so well, like Eisenhower, right? Eisenhower will try this method with OPEC, and it fails. OPEC basically would limit us from good prices of oil for like 30 years, right? So that was an issue, right? So that's kind of the background to the big stick policy, kind of what it is as well. But yeah. Any other questions? Terms that you want to talk about? Okay, so this is what's going to happen. I know that we have my period 9 had already been a unit ahead of everybody. Okay, they are a unit ahead of everyone. So I know that periods 3 and 5 are you're on unit 3. Just finished unit. So you're on unit 3. Period 9 is on unit 4. So this is what's going to happen. Okay. In the time that I'm talking about the outline, I did provide a nice little review area for you to do something. Okay. And you can work alongside other members of period 9 if you would like. Okay. Basically, there's a period 4 SIQs little file here. You're not going to write every SIQ. There's like a whole bunch of list of ones. Okay. You're going to pick one to write. You can pick any one you want to write here. There's a lot of good ones. They all kind of cover different topics of unit 4. And because the fact that you're on unit 4, it kind of gives you a nice little prep before we jump into the outline for unit 4. Okay. So pick one SAQ to do for unit 4. And I would say write it down on paper. You have paper with you. Okay. You pick any one of these that you want. You make sure you just write down the question so you have it for yourself. As people from period 3 and period 5 are listening, and I would make sure that you listen, okay? Because I want to get through that unit so we all can catch up and do unit 4, okay? All right. This is period. All right. What's that again? Okay. Let's see. We're gonna try to, yeah. Not today, no. Yeah, today's gonna be that's way too hard to get to all the way there. Okay. So period 3, where were you left off at? You didn't start it. Yeah.
Period 5 was we just finished Enlightenment and Great Awakening.
You just finished Enlightenment and Great Awakening?
Yeah.
Enlightenment and Great Awakening. But that's period, that's unit 2.
Yeah,
Oh, that means you guys are on the beginning of unit 3. Yeah, okay. That means you're all on the same page then. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna try to zoom in a little bit because I know that screen's a little farther away. These sheets are also available on Schoology right now under the outline area. Okay, so obviously that they are also available. So if you miss something, then you can just write in anything you're missing. Okay. If you cannot see, maybe attempt to move up for closer up. Like I said, I will try to move up as much as possible, but I do want to have everything included on the writing. Okay. So when you think of unit 3, keep in mind the year. Okay, the period of time. Every unit is regards to a certain time period that you should know. Unit 3 regards that before the Revolutionary War, so think about the French Indian War, all the way to the election of Thomas Jefferson, okay? 1754 to 1800. So remember, this is technically the first unit where you could see a DBQ topic technically, okay? Have I seen many DBQ topics focus on unit 3? Not really, okay? LEQ topics? Yes, I have. Because remember, LEQs can be consistent of every unit can be covered in an LEQ. But what's good about the LEQ is that it gives you a choice. You can choose between units 1, 2, or 3 for the first question, 4, 5, 6 for the second question, 7, 8, 9 for the third question. Okay. It gives you that benefit of picking, but like, just keep in mind, like, the later units you go, there's way more topics that could be. I've seen a lot of kids pick the first question because units 1, 2, and 3 are very small. There's not a lot of possibility of topics. Most of the time, the topics consist of either going to be a impact of the Columbian Exchange or the causes of American Revolution or the impact of the French Indian War. Those have always been the consistent of that. Okay, so let's get started. Basically, the key context of this era is that during this time period, there was a constant wars that were going on between 3 separate nations, between Spain, France, and Britain. They were fighting for 70 plus years all the time over colonial conquest and expansion and what were the boundaries between them. Okay, that's kind of the key thing. They are all battling against each other. There's multiple different wars that they named. Don't have to memorize the wars. You just have to know that they were fighting against each other. And obviously what that means is constant debt. Like they have to constantly spend money on wars and conflicts. Now, the French Indian War, there's a few things that you should know. Okay, specifically, this all really starts in the area known as the Ohio River Valley. Think about the area of Ohio in West Pennsylvania. That's generally where we're thinking about. Okay. Now, basically, what happens is that is the border between what the British already controlled and what the French had controlled. So what happens is the British really want to expand themselves into the fur trade. So what they do is they give permission to a company known as the Ohio Company to go and develop fur trade in this area, knowing full well that the French already control the fur trade and land of that area already. Now, when they tell them to go do this, there's obviously going to be a problem. The French had already developed Fort Duquesne, which is technically in modern-day Pennsylvania today, to prevent the western expansion of the British. Now, what this results in is an altercation. I think it was Lieutenant General George Washington was sent to, I think it was Lieutenant Colonel, actually. Lieutenant Colonel George Washington was sent to go and to try to stop this or expand into this area. But he was surprised that all the tribes that were there were already allied with the French. And we knew this because if you remember how the French colonized, they cared about these alliances, right? That's the whole goal. Now, basically, when Washington loses here, this is ultimately going to result in the conflict that originally going to happen. Okay. Now, what's important is that before they really get into a full-scale war, before they get into a full-scale war, the colonists meet with the British to kind of discuss what's their next plan. So they meet in Albany and they come up with what they call the Plan of Union. Now, the colonists, specifically like Ben Franklin, said they should be the ones to decide what happens with the war effort on their own land because they know it better. They feel like they're ready for this. And the British tell them, no, you're not going to decide this. They are the colonies. The British are the governor, like the control of them. They're not going to make decisions here. This shows you that the colonists wanted to control it themselves because they wanted they already were under self-rule and they had the confidence thinking that they can do whatever they wanted to, right? So obviously when you think about the overall, I'll get out of the way, I'll zoom out a little bit here just so you can see a little bit more, okay? Now overall, the plan by William Pitt was that he would invest all of his resources into the colonies and try to stop Canada, the connection between the natural resources that France was selling to fund the war. If they can block the fur trade, then that means the war will end a lot faster. So that's the whole plan. That they're going to use the St. Lawrence River to prevent trade. They will then conquer each different colony, and eventually that would be the ultimate result of this. Now, the effects of the war are probably the most important thing that you should know. And I list a few things here. Firstly, the Treaty of Paris makes it so that France is completely kicked out of the New World. Obviously, they're going to have a lot of resentment towards the British for this because they obviously used to make a lot of money off of this situation. And they eventually have to sell the Louisiana Territory to Spain to make up some of the debts that they had with them. So that's what they do. Okay. Secondly, the British was already in debt, but this only made it worse. They were in so much debt that now need to get more revenue. They need to increase taxes, sell more products. They need to do all these different things. So that is kind of a context to the situation that we see with the American Revolution. Now, when it comes to the colonists, they gain a new wave of confidence in themselves that they can handle any sort of problems that comes their way, right? They think that they can govern themselves, that they have no issues whatsoever. They think they're on top of the world. The British, on their other hand, look at them as being someone that's a liability. Like they are too weak to defend themselves, and the British have to step up and always have to defend them all the time. And they felt as if they didn't do enough in the French-Indian War, so they didn't really think of them too highly of them. And lastly is the Proclamation Line of 1763. Now, the context of this is Pontiac's Rebellion. Now, one of the key things that happens after the war is over and the British gain all this land territory all the way to the Mississippi River is that basically all these settlers want to go and just funnel into these areas and basically try to live there. Now, when that happens in modern day Detroit, there were tribes led by Pontiac rebelled against the settlers' basically movement into that region and basically started an entire rebellion where settlers die, the British soldiers die that went to go defend them, and the British had basically were tired of it. So they said, you can't have nice things, and I'm blocking you from going into this area. He creates the Proclamation Line, which is an imaginary line that prevents any settlers from going west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, the reason why this is super important is because it basically makes the colonists feel as if they're being treated poorly, mainly because they didn't actually get the spoils of victory. Like they helped the British fight the war, but they didn't actually gain anything. They never gained the land and never gained wealth and never gained even recognition that they actually were part of the successful effort. So this caused a lot of resentment between the colonists and the British because they didn't gain any of these things. Okay. Now, next part is the road to revolution. Now, when it comes to the road to revolution, there's a lot of things that you could say. If they give you an LQ question on what causes the American Revolution, you should literally be like, thank you, everything. Like this is the easiest question that you could have as an LEQ because there's so many examples that you could provide for this. Now, one of the first things is, think about it, the British need revenue. They need money back to pay off debt. So what are they going to do? They're going to start passing taxes, acts, to force the colonists to pay money to the British government to make up the lost amount of wealth that they had from the war. So I listed a bunch of different acts here. Probably the worst one of the four is the Stamp Act because of everything requires a government stamp to be processed and sent like mail, right, in newspapers and things like that. And remember how connected the colonists were to the print culture and print revolution. That meant like everything that they cared about was being taxed, which is a lot more money than they would like. Now, there's a lot of protests that happened because of this. I listed a few of them here, right? First one, Boston Massacre, right? It was basically protesting outside a tax collector's house. There was altercation, shots were fired, people got killed. John Adams defended the soldiers. They were let go, but it didn't actually fix the problems that were going on between the two groups. We also see the Committee of Correspondence and the rise of the Sons of Liberty. Okay, the Committee of Correspondence basically was a connection that was made between all the colonies. So just in case if there was an issue in another colony, everyone could still be connected, right? Sons of Liberty was a group of people considered, from the British perspective, was considered to be like terrorists because they were going after tax collectors. They were doing actions to go against British government all around. They were doing a lot of those different things. But the last one here, the Boston Tea Party, is the last really protest you see. It was after the Tea Act, which basically made a monopoly for the British East India Company, basically so that they have to buy their tea. They throw all the tea into the harbor, okay? Now, a lot of things happen after this, all the way to the point of the actual revolution. Now, in retaliation to the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts were passed, basically really put a lot of emphasis on restricting specifically Massachusetts colony for a lot of the issues that they had started, but also kind of rubbed dirt in the wound by passing the Quebec Act, which basically gave Canada the ability to do whatever they wanted. You could practice whatever religion you wanted. You become your own colonies. You can do whatever you want. This was basically a spit in the face of the colonists who wanted access to Canada and more land to make more states. So, or make more colonies and become more connected. That's part of the reason why they were so angry about it. But what we see right away is that the colonists are going to meet and discuss what should they do. And that's what the Continental Congresses are. They're basically moments where all the leaders of the different colonies would meet at a central place behind the scenes and discuss what's their next plan of action. The first Continental Congress, not much occurred, right? The biggest thing that happened was they planned to meet again at a later date, and they wanted to have an open forum to say, we will repeal your decision-making, like the British decision-making on these acts and show their discontent for what's going on. Now, behind the scenes in other locations, this is where things start to get more violent, specifically in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, we have several battles happen. Lexington and Concord happens outside of Boston, and keep in mind of the dates. April of 1775, okay? And the second battle is Bunker Hill in June of 1775. Now, in keeping times of like thinking about a timeline here, in April, right, is Lexington and Concord. They meet again at the Second Continental Congress in May. And at that meeting, they state that after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which was brutal, it was the first shot between both groups. They say that we need to format a military force just in case things get worse. So George Washington was appointed as the next continental commander of the military, just in case they go to war. But they also put out what they call a olive branch petition. This was their last effort to try to make peace, right? They appeal to the king because they think that the king is on their side. Because remember, they're under what they call a constitutional monarchy, where the king as well as parliament make decisions on what happens. At first, most colonists thought that parliament was the main reason why problems were happening, because they're the ones that are allowed to pass taxes and things upon the colonists. So a lot of these people thought that if they appealed to the king, that somehow they could convince parliament to ease up on these taxes, but they didn't know that the king was part of it. So that was part of the problem, that once they appeal, it goes unanswered. So this only leads to more issues, and a lot of them were debating on whether they should go to a full-on revolution or not. Now, between the elites, they were highly educated, spoke very difficult English to understand, and you saw some of their documents could be over the top English, but most common folk didn't understand what was the best thing to do. So in January of 1776, Thomas Paine writes Common Sense. It was a pamphlet written in vernacular, or like in common language, so that everybody can understand. And so when he wrote this pamphlet, it was mirroring the same idealisms that a lot of the patriots were thinking of, but he does it more in a common way for the ordinary person to listen, to understand, and to kind of appeal to. So he says that, it mirrors a lot of things that John Locke stated about natural rights, that you should, that the government is not protecting your natural rights, so why should you abide by what they tell you to do? And also goes after people saying that if you think that the British or your parents, that they're here to help you, then you are wrong. The only thing they care about is your money. And if you think otherwise, then there's something wrong with you. And he says that all this is common sense, that if you can't see that this is the only opportunity that you have to gain your independence, then you've already lost, right? So he appeals this way, and it is very successful. More people in the public will support the revolution, but even that being the case, it still was roughly around 30% each. And when it comes to whether you're a patriot, you are a loyalist, or you're still neutral. Now, granted, I think more people as time went on supported the patriot cause, but generally, even at this point, it was still roughly 30-30-30, okay? Maybe a little bit more extra on the patriot side because of the pamphlet, but roughly around that spot. Because of the fact that people were still uneasy on what they should do, okay? Okay, questions on leading to the war. Because if you see a LEQ question on the American Revolution, there's so much stuff that you could say. Like it's such an easy topic to write about. I would highly recommend doing that one. I think a few years ago they had that, and all the kids were like, that was the easiest thing I've ever had to do, right? Some of them about the Clement Exchange, another extremely easy one to do. Now the war. The only thing you really need to know about the war, I kind of reiterate the same thing again, 30% each group. But the key thing you have to know about the war, not necessarily every battle. There are some that I list here, like the Battle of Saratoga. You should know, basically because the British's plan was to control the Hudson River, divide the colonists in half so that they can divide and conquer. Battle of Saratoga prevents that from happening, but also gains us the ability gains us alliance with the French to help us in the remaining parts of the war. That is probably the biggest thing when it comes to that battle. The Battle of Yorktown was considered the final battle or final victory. So that's the other thing. You might just see a question about that, but nothing specific on what happened at the Battle of Yorktown. They'll just say maybe impact, or they might give you a collection of events that happened and how are they similar? How are they different? Things like that. Okay. Now, the big thing is understanding how did we win, as well as the effects of the war. That's really the big thing to know about the war itself. So the French are the biggest reasons why we won. You don't know. They supplied resources. They supplied a navy to create a blockade. They didn't send ground soldiers themselves, but they gave us a lot of resources to help us with the war. Then, obviously, a very smart leadership from people like George Washington. He kind of organized us in a very good way. We are all new to war, or I say new to war, but we're all just common people that were fighting, and he kind of organized us to be a very effective fighting force. And lastly, we're fighting a defensive war. The fact that we were in a good spot where they have to go into our colonies and conquer every colony in order for them to win. That's a difficult thing to do. Now, overall, the effects are as follows. Okay, the biggest thing is that we are now officially a nation. Now, we still owe a lot of money. We still owe a lot of debt, and that is a problem we'll have to face right early on in this new country. But we are now officially a country. We do have to know, though, the real losers of the war, and this is actually an activity we did right after the American Revolution. Basically, when you think about the losers of the war, I think I forgot to mention one more, which is the Native Americans. But when you think about the losers, loyalists, a lot of them left the country after because we were persecuting them. We were taking away their land, even though we agreed in the Treaty of Paris that we wouldn't do that. We actually did anyway. Women lose a lot of the possibility of rights. Right after the war ended, there was a lot of discussion of how do we go about making the law, like our law system, and it was already kind of created during the end of the war with the Articles of Confederation. But women like Abigail Adams, who was obviously the wife of John Adams, would appeal and say, hey, listen, don't forget about us. We helped you out in the war. We really deserve rights to vote and things. And he said himself, I'll try, but I can't give you any promises based on how the rest of the country is. And he wasn't wrong, right? That was a problem, and most of the country didn't agree with it. So they did not gain rights. Women did not gain rights for a very long time. And obviously, slavery will only expand from this point on. Most countries in Europe were looking to possibly end slavery not too long away from this point, right? Early 1800s, did they really stop slavery all around? In a lot of places, they stopped the slave trade at least, but other places stopped it altogether. The United States didn't stop slavery until the end of the Civil War. So that shows you just the extent of how bad it was. Native Americans will only lose the land from here on out. That is the other impact. Okay. Any questions there? We're good. So the next part is just post-American Revolution. To kind of give you context, this is a piece of a PowerPoint slide. Basically, the thing you need to know is that we were in the Articles of Confederation. Okay, I'll just scroll right down here. You don't write down every single strength and weakness. This just gives you a nice little chart to show the differences. The Articles of Confederation, if I was going to narrow down the biggest things to know of the biggest problems that this has, is the fact that each state has its own currency, okay, means that the federal government can't regulate currency at all. One of the key components of the federal government today is that they can regulate currency all around, right? They have the ability to do that. They can tax, they can collect taxes, they can do anything they want when it comes to, organizing currency for all the different states because it's all shared. But in the Articles of Confederation, every currency was different and they had to ask for taxes. They couldn't demand, they couldn't force any state to pay a single tax, which is a problem. Even when it comes to for military purposes, I think I don't have it on this list here, but there's no national military. It was each militia of every state worked on its own, and that was a major problem. Some of the successes that you could say the Articles of Confederation had was they were the group that voted on the Treaty of Paris to end the war, so they did work as a voting body for that. They also did work in voting in the Northwest Ordinance, which basically kind of outlined how they would organize states going forward, the land ordinance, how they were going to collect and gain new land, and organize different colonies for the future. They did do those things, but the weaknesses outweighed the strengths, and that's kind of the key component. Now, some examples, okay, the issue I would say you should know about the Articles, and it shows the clear problems, is Shays' Rebellion. Okay, now when it comes to the debt collecting problem that they had, Articles of Confederation was in so much debt. The government was in so much debt after the war that a lot of people were not getting paid their wages. Like, for example, a lot of farmers were struggling. A lot of former soldiers were still waiting on checks to being paid for being soldiers, and they were struggling. So they started to rebel. Specifically in Massachusetts, they rebelled and actually gained the stockpile of weapons there. Now, this is not a massive rebellion to a large extent that would destroy the entire country. That's not what this was. This was a small rebellion that took so long for them to put, like I say so long, it was like a month maximum, but it took for them a lot longer to put down this rebellion compared to what should have happened, right? And basically it was because Massachusetts was not prepared and they needed help from the federal government. So they appealed to the federal government for help to gain soldiers. We had to ask the other states for help. Nobody except for Virginia sent anything. So it just shows you that what happens if this was a massive rebellion? What happens if this was another country that was invading? That is a problem. And that shows you why a lot of people in the country were now debating, should we change the entire system? Should we change our entire law? Should we create a brand new law system? Should we organize a government that can meet the needs of what we need to do? Okay. And so they started to come up with possible plans of changing, right? Some of those were going to be like Virginia plan, which creates the House of Representatives saying everything should be based on population. New Jersey plan, every state should have the same number of votes. The Connecticut Compromise, which is a combination of the two. Connecticut creates basically a two-house legislator that is, one is a lot larger than other, the other one's more smaller, so it allows them to have more powers, but they have two groups that they can vote on laws and policies. That's what our Congress is today. Now, other things that they also discussed were going to be like, how do you handle slaves when it comes to population? You count 3/5 of every slave counts as 3/5 points towards population. And I mentioned the impact of that is that any state that has more slaves or more slaves in general will have more power in the House of Representatives, which means that southern states will have immense power in the House of Representatives going forward. So there's a reason why that there's not really a lot of laws restricting slavery, because the House of Representatives is dominated by southern states, right? That's part of the reason why. Now, what this also does do is it creates a debate overall between two factions, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The mindset here was that one group, the Federalists, wants a stronger federal government, okay? They want a government that is bigger all around. They want a brand new law system known as the Constitution, so that they can give strength to the federal government, so it's way more influential than the Articles. The Anti-Federalists want the opposite. They want the Articles of Confederation to stay, and they want to rework it, revamp it, add some laws to it that makes it better, right? That's their mindset. Now, what happens is these two groups start to debate on an open forum. They start making essays and newspaper articles and just journal entries shown to the public to put their ideas forward. And that's what the Federalist Papers and Brutus Papers are. Federalist Papers are written by the Federalists. Their mindset was, if you can have a larger government, more people involved in it, more factions available, that means that it's more difficult for one particular group to control everything. More factions means that everyone is competing for power, because in their mindset that every politician, every person, wants power for themselves. But if you have so much more people involved, then it's hard for any one particular person to control everything. So that means they have to compromise to get anything done, which is only beneficial. The Brutus Papers were saying, well, the problem with having a large federal government is that if one person does have the ability to control, they could possibly become a tyrant. And their example that they provide is, think about what happens with Rome. In Rome, when Julius Caesar takes over, okay, he was a legal dictator of Rome. That was part of their law policy. They're allowed to do that in times of crisis. And when Julius Caesar is dictator, he starts passing a lot of reforms, which made the people like him a lot. The problem is that when he loved his popularity so much, when it was time for him to relinquish his power, he never did. So he stayed as dictator and was this close to making himself dictator for life. And that's why Brutus had to stab him in the back, which is why they nicknamed the papers Brutus Papers, because it was symbolic for saying if the federal government gets too strong, then that's over, right? You can't relinquish the power anymore. So that was the two mindsets. Now, eventually, it leads to what the creation of the Bill of Rights. The anti-federalists agreed to the Constitution being ratified as long as they have a Bill of Rights, a list of rights of individuals and states to be protected, just in case if a person tries to become a tyrant, you can't break basic rights that people have. Think about the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, like, all search and seizure. These are all things that are basic rights according to the founding fathers of what is essential to what people care about, right? But it's not just for people, it's for states. Okay, so just keep that in mind. All right, any questions? Am I going too fast to anybody? If I'm going too fast, you just tell me I'm going too fast. Okay, good. All right, so I'll talk briefly about each of the last few things are President Washington and Adams. I give you a nice little table here about the early political parties that do start to form. So the Federalists and Democratic Republicans are the two parties here. Bless you. Some things about Washington you should know. Firstly, he creates a lot of basic kind of standards for presidents going forward. Okay. One of the first things, he creates a cabinet. Guys, he creates a cabinet. Okay. He basically outlines, he gives a bunch of different positions to people to help him organize his government. The two key people to know, Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury. Now, Hamilton, since he's leading the Treasury and trying to handle this debt, he needs institutions to help him do so. So, examples of this would be the National Bank. Okay. The National Bank basically was a very controversial topic because it wasn't outlined in the Constitution that it could be made. But Hamilton makes the case that it eventually does allow it to be created, but he makes a case because it is necessary for him to do his job. And a part of the Constitution, they call this the elastic clause. It's a clause that makes it where if something is necessary and proper for you to do your duties, then you're allowed to have this there. So that's what the National Bank is there for, and he makes his case to Washington. Washington agrees and says, okay, National Bank is created. Now, what this does do is it creates an entire debate between two separate groups that form, which is the first two political parties. Now, as you can see here, I'm not going to go through every single bullet on the parties list here, but there are stark differences between the both of them. Some clear ones would be things like the interpretation of the Constitution. Are they strict or are they loose interpretation? Like, are they following it to a T or not? Do they favor a strong federal government or a weaker federal government? Those are all basic things. The long list here, but like I said, they all kind of have the differences. Yeah, go ahead, Anderson.
Washington against formation 270.
Yes, he was. And essentially, he makes that clear in his farewell address. Like, at first, they just do it anyway. And what happens is he sees the problem that it does arise with, right? And that's why he says that. Now, when it comes to his foreign policy, okay, Washington is trying to stay as neutral as possible. That's his thing. Okay, that's where a lot of people will fault him on. Because when he tries to stay neutral, when overseas, there are problems like France and Britain are battling against each other. They're facing off each other in war. He wants to stay out of everyone's business. He wants to stay. He's saying the United States is too weak. We cannot do anything in this case. We need to stay out of it. So what he does try to do, though, is try to create peace by sending ministers over to try to negotiate issues that are happening. Like, for example, impressment is a thing that's already going on. So under Washington, impressment, if you don't remember, was where the other nation could basically attach your boat, steals all the people and cargo, and forces your sailors to work on their boat, almost like slaves. Now, what's important is that they tried to attempt to make peace. So the Jay's Treaty, the Chief Justice at the time, John Jay, was sent over to try to negotiate the stopping of impressment. It doesn't really work out at all. Right? It doesn't actually work. But one thing it does do is it kind of scares Spain into thinking that we made an alliance with Britain. And so they reach out to us and say, hey, let's be friends here. We'll give you the Missouri Territory and access to the port of New Orleans if you give us some money and we make some peace here. And we do. We end up buying the Missouri Territory. We gain more land, gain access to New Orleans, which is a great thing. Now, with that being said, let's look at his domestic policies. The only thing you have to really know about his domestic policy is that he's facing some interaction or issues with Native American tribes out in the West, and this was known as the Northwest Confederacy. This group was located in Ohio. So basically what happens is we are facing off against them. We send a military force there. They put down this rebellion and they end up signing what they call the Treaty of Grenville, which basically just means it opens up Ohio Valley for more settlement. And that's really the big thing for there. The last one is the Risky Rebellion. Hamilton was placing a lot of taxes to raise revenue so they can pay off debt. One of those taxes was the tax on whiskey. Okay. Now, whiskey, obviously, alcohol was such a big thing in the country from the early time periods. A lot more, it was safer to drink sometimes than water. So they thought this was a pretty big deal. They thought that they can do something similar like Shays' Rebellion did. Obviously, they were wrong. Washington steps up, puts down the rebellion in like a heartbeat. It ends any sort of feelings that rebellion is always the answer to any issues you may have, right? Now, the last thing he says is his farewell address. And you can see at the last line here, basically, he sees the issues going on in the country and he leaves after 8 years. And his final thing he does, because they obviously he was the trendsetter for a lot of the presidents, like basically every president followed a lot of the trends he does. And after 8 years, he said, all right, I'm going to retire. I'm leaving. It's up to somebody else to kind of take the reins and become the next president. So before he leaves, he does his farewell address and he warns the country of several things. He says, well, based on what I see right now, there are a lot of problems that we are already getting involved with. One, we should not make alliances with other foreign entities politically, right? He's okay with trade. Trade is not the problem. It's if you make alliances with a country politically, then you are now tied with them on every problem that they are getting involved with, right? That's one example of why you listen to him, because think about World War I, World War II, alliances were the main cause of those problems. Secondly, he says not to form political parties. Even though political parties were already formed, he says, I watch what's going on between the two parties, and I'm not a fan of what this is already doing to the country. And because the fact is these political parties will divide you. And the last thing he says is do not fall into sectionalism. Okay. Sectionalism means that you're dividing yourselves based on section, right? Based on the area of the country you are. Are you a northerner or a southerner? And a lot of times people still make that mistake, because what happens is if you divide yourself based on section, then looks like you have more loyalty to that section rather than the country. And you already know this word sectionalism, if you remember doing the practice like DBQ stuff, that literally is part of the causes of the Civil War itself. Okay, so that is an issue that he kind of points out. We don't listen to him, and that's kind of the issue here. Last one is John Adams. This is very short. These words a little big because I just want to make sure you know them. But John Adams' presidency, he kind of steps into a situation where France and England are already continuing doing impressment. He tries to make peace. So he sends over diplomats to France to try to talk with the prime minister and say, hey, let's like settle these issues right now. They basically stop the ministers from going to see like the prime minister or the diplomats within the prime minister and say, you need to give us $1 million each or else you won't go see him. They obviously, this is a bribe. They get really angry about this. They go tell John Adams. This event's known as the XYZ affair. Mainly the reason why is because you never know the names of the 3 people that stopped them. So they call them X, Y, and Z. Okay. Now, what this does do is a lot of people in the country wanted to go to war. Specifically, the Federalists want to go to war. John Adams actually goes against his own party and says, we're not going to go to war, but I will bolster up the military just in case that does have to happen. He gets a lot of flack from his own party for doing so. Now, in response to the issues with France, we start to see the Alien and Sedition Acts. This is considered to be kind of the downfall of him as the president and actually the Federalist Party as a whole. Okay, because of the growing immigration from France to the United States, a lot of Federalists wanted to prevent them from voting for the Democratic Republicans. Most French immigrants usually sided with that party because the leader of the party, Thomas Jefferson, has close ties with France. So a lot of those immigrants had kind of believed in the same mindset as they did. So the Federalists, including John Adams, passed laws like Naturalization Act, the Alien Act, and Sedition Acts in preventing for a few things. The Naturalization Act basically makes it harder for a person who is an immigrant to become a citizen. Now, what this does is normally it used to be 5 years. You would have to wait 5 years in order to vote in any election. Now it's increased to be 14 years where you can become a citizen. So that really prevents any new immigrant to vote in any election for a very long time. Okay, Alien Acts makes it so that any immigrant can be detained or deported if they are deemed to be dangerous. So this is very opinionated. It could be whatever the Federalists want to be thrown out. And sedition. The Sedition Act basically makes it's like a censoring of people. If someone talks bad against the government, they can essentially censor you and basically put you in jail for talking bad against the government. Now, obviously, looking at these laws, you're like, this is stupid and this is a bad decision. It was, because what happens directly after this is the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Basically, we have states that come forward and say we are not abiding by what you say or not following what you're saying here, and it's illegal, it's unconstitutional. Now, the reason why this is super important is because it shows how the states are trying to exude the power of denying the ability to have to follow a federal law. This sets up nullification. Okay. Remember, multiple times they have nullification crises that occur in the country. This is the first time we've seen this. Now, they do pull away the resolutions before the election, but this does give a lot of people mindsets that this is a policy that you could do. All right. And eventually results in Thomas Jefferson winning the election. Okay. And that's Unit 3. Now, I could give people like a few minutes, but I want to guess the Unit 4 because I feel like in period 9 people have been sitting here like, I want to do Unit 4, right? And I've been waiting to do Unit 4. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Take a 5-minute break. We'll get through Unit 4 so that you're done with Unit 4. My suggestion is if you want to sit in here, you want to do something, like you can do some practice questions that were on Schoology. No problem. There's still more donuts.
For like all the units, or like which ones are we doing?
We're gonna get through Unit 4 for sure.
Unit 4?
Yeah, we're gonna get through Unit 4 just because I wanted to go over Unit 3 because that other your class was a period ahead of everybody. So
Yeah.
um
So we're gonna do Unit 4 for now.
no, we're gonna do Unit 4 right now.
Here?
Yeah.
And then Unit 5 in class.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. What is nullification?
Nullification is basically the state law to the federal law. What's up? No, they'll still be in the I can make this do after. I can make this do like
Yeah.
Yeah, like think about it. Because of how even the copies laws work, it basically means that for example, this is Madison State, this is Jefferson State. These are two people who are adamantly against John Adams.
Why would you guys call that? Like why?
Because they realize that totally political. And basically all French, because at the time most immigrants arriving were French. And most French immigrants usually voted. Other than the often more than that's why Thomas Jefferson was basically the representative of Virginia. And Adams
So like, like Adams, Jefferson was Democrat. And his future vice president in Madison was. So they were adamantly against. Basically, the policy because and they were. I don't even know.
And they were.
And basically, they were definitely. It's like. So that way, they were doing. Well, like said, we're gonna have work against the old. A lot of these policies, there's nothing but there's basically nothing in terms of people that but they're saying that. Well, it's more people had like more people like training. And basically, also, I'm talking about the medical plans. All you can do is provide. All you can do is provide evidence.
How do you think it's expected?
Well, a lot of that actually. I don't know if it's profit. Maybe you have to know.
It's like analyze stuff.
I was thinking, no, how to write the format. That might put.
So, John, I said it's like, that you guys, parents, like impressed with it, or like, that.
Yeah, so even Adams was with both Adams and Congress. Congress was controlled by the federal. Like this same part. They were not on the Democratic Republican because of like I said before, nations of the France is going to be like they're being more major. So that's what it has to be. Now, yeah,
It's split into two.
And the people of the parties and and during that gap, during that time, we all people were united. But then eventually they split. So like think about the Whigs and the Whig party was like a party. But they used to be a part of the Democratic Party.
All right, so let's get started. Alrighty. All right, guys, you ready?
Ready.
All right. All right, so, hey guys, listen up, listen up. So this is unit 4. All right, this is unit 4. So this is everyone is now caught up. Okay, everyone's not caught up. So that means like most likely Monday we're gonna do unit 5. I will try to record every session I do in class and same method, so that at least then you have these recordings available for you. The outlines will all be provided for you on Schoology, so you always can look back at those as well. So what don't you do on this side? I'll move the donuts over. We're gonna definitely get through 4. By the time that it might be like already 10 or 12. I don't want to hold everyone against later. I will 5. All right. Figure out where you're sitting. We gotta get started. Okay, first things first. Keep in mind the dates. Okay. Remember, every time you think about periods of time, you should know the context of what era that we're talking about. So, period 4 relatively is a decent amount of years. Okay, period 4 is 1800 to 1848. Right now, the first thing we have to talk about is Jefferson. Right, I'll zoom out a little bit here. Is everyone able to see what is set on the board? Yes. I see some people say no. Let me just zoom in a little bit more. That's his best. Yeah. Yes, it should be an outline. Go to outline. You have the outlines, period 4 outline should be there. So if you want to bring it up on like a computer right in front of you as I go through it, that might help too. Okay. It's on the review, go to study guides and go to outlines.
Period 4 bigger than period 3.
Yes. Period 4. So listen. So what I do to help you out is I do condense the amount of words I say to help you out more for unit 4, right? And even same thing with unit 5. I condense the wording so that's not you have to write down as much. Okay. Now, for Thomas Jefferson, the big thing to start out with is knowing that a lot of people always reference that his election was known as a revolution of 1800 for a few reasons. First reason is because most countries at this point, whenever there's a change of power from one political party to another, it usually gets very violent. But in this case, it was very peaceful. There was a peaceful transition of power. That was the reason why that's one. Secondly, because Thomas Jefferson, being the leader of the Democratic Republicans, from his point on, for roughly the next 4 presidencies, they'll be all Democratic Republicans. So this shows you that there's a lot of influence from him going forward, right? And most of this entire era was all controlled mainly by Democratic Republicans. So that's why it's such a big deal. Now, when you think about Thomas Jefferson's first actions, he tries to stay as bipartisan as possible, as in staying in the middle of both different groups. As in, even though he is not a fan of the bank, he keeps the bank because he realizes that it actually was working for what the whole purpose was. He limits the size of the military, which is more on his point of view, and he also repeals certain taxes like the whiskey tax, which was more of a Democratic Republican concept. Go ahead, Anderson.
Do you think by him trying to remain bipartisan, people were really supportive of that?
Yes, they were. Like, that was the thing. Like, a lot of people were afraid that if you can sharpen it, it's okay. If he was being restrictive on a lot of Federalist policies, it would seem to be like he was favoritizing one side, which causes resentment. And then, so he was saying, I'm going to be on the middle. And it shows like the other side, like, okay, he's trying to play ball. Now, granted, it didn't solve every problem, but at least attempted to show that he's trying to be in the middle. Now, his major goal, like as a president, was to try to expand the country to be a farming-based society. His dream was the agrarian dream, which just means a society of farmers. that will be the base of the entire country, which then can produce more food, more resources, which only helps populations go up. So one of the first things that he does, you can show this by his overall mindset, was the Louisiana Purchase. Now, at the time, Louisiana was owned. Remember, it originally was owned by Spain, and the whole good thing about the situation was that we also had access to the port of New Orleans. But we all know that when France kind of takes back the territory of Louisiana and takes back the port of New Orleans, this causes a lot of problems. Remember, the Pinckney Treaty was signed, giving us the access to that port, which was great. But now that it's changed hands, that entire treaty is null and void. So we now need to go and try to gain access to this and possibly try to, try to buy the port of New Orleans. Eventually, we end up buying the entirety of the Louisiana territory for $15 million. Yeah, you don't have to memorize the money, cash, whatever. But the key thing is that this obviously is a big deal because of the fact that it was not part of the Constitution allowing for the president to make that purchase. Only Congress can approve purchases like that. So Thomas Jefferson was essentially breaking his own code of ethics. He basically was, just not. He basically did the opposite of what he was preaching this whole time. Now, obviously, Congress will approve the purchase overall, and when that happens, he ends up sending Lewis and Clark to go see the entire territory and a map outline basically everything that's there, from people to animals to good trails for using for travel, so they know that they just doubled the size of the country, and that was obviously a major benefit of that. Now, some other things that happened in this time early on in his presidency, other domestic issues that occur, is the issue with the midnight judges. Okay. So a lot of the stuff I mentioned here is already just reviewed. Okay. But midnight judges. So basically the way that the executive power works is that you can appoint federal judges when you're the president. And one of the things that John Adams was trying to do before he was officially no longer the president was trying to appoint as many judges to federal courts as humanly possible, nicknaming the event as the midnight judges. So he was like, as all the way up until midnight, after the last night, he was trying to appoint as many judges as possible. One of the people he appoints, ironically, was his Secretary of State, John Marshall, as a chief justice, as a judge in the federal courts, Supreme Court specifically. Now, John Marshall's job, was to deliver the appointments officially, making them on record. But he didn't get to deliver all the appointments. So the problem is that once that new president, Thomas Jefferson, steps into power, his Secretary of State at the time, which is obviously Madison, his job is now to deliver the rest of them. He tells them not to deliver them, which causes the problem between Marbury, who was supposed to be a judge added to the federal court, and he sues Madison in court and he gets all the way to the Supreme Court, this whole issue. Now, eventually, they decide that, yes, Marbury should have been a judge, and it was Marshall's fault, because ironically, Marshall was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So he's basically ruling on his own mistake that he made. And he says, yes, the former Secretary of State should have delivered all the appointments. They didn't. Marbury should be a judge, but he's not. And, this policy should not have even been a thing. And they're saying that they should have had the Supreme Court should have had the role of reviewing a law before it's official. This creates judicial review. This is super important. It creates a whole new function for the Supreme Court, granting them more powers than they probably have ever had to that point. Basically means that every law that is created, they must check that. Any questions there? Now, the only reason why I think I put Louisiana Purchase after this is because technically by date, it happens after the Marbury versus Madison, this situation. But I already kind of went over Louisiana Purchase. Land deal, officially $15 million. It was very against Thomas Jefferson's policies. Obviously, once it's done and officially sealed by Congress and agreed upon by Congress, Lewis and Clark expedition happens, outlining everything. Okay. I think you already wrote that stuff down. If not, then I'll scroll down a little bit more so you can see more of the next part. Okay. Okay. So obviously the first 4 years of Jefferson's presidency were a massive success. Okay, he had gained a lot of popularity because Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the country. He was doing well. When he ran for election, he won. Now, he removed Aaron Burr as his vice president, right, on a second run because he was psycho, right? He ends up joining the Federalist Party, trying to gain members of Federalist Party in New York to secede and to start a brand new country. The head of the Federalist Party, which was Hamilton, basically was like, we need to like talk it down off like being a psycho. And he says, you're besmirching my honor. They have a duel. Hamilton gets killed in the duel. Now, like the whole issue with this is that Hamilton was the head of the party. He was the person who really got the party going. And when he gets killed, it kind of marks the official end of the party in general because there's no effective leadership anymore. And the most popular person of the party is now gone. Burr gets away with it, basically gets acquitted because there were issues with the trial. He gets acquitted. He eventually dies in like 1836, but don't have to worry about that. It's just showing you that Hamilton dying is a pretty big deal. Okay. Now, some of the things that he does foreign policy wise does have major impacts on the following president. So Thomas Jefferson basically was dealing with an issue with what they call the Barbary Pirates. This group was kind of constantly attacking merchant ships from the United States for many, many years. They are located in Northern Africa, so they would attack merchant boats traveling to Europe often. So Thomas Jefferson was really the first president that actually used any sort of navy that they had to really put down the Barbary Pirates, allowing them to trade easily to Europe for the remaining parts of his years as president. Now, the only problem is that basically impressment was still going on because the other side, for example, if we were trading with France, the British would actually attack our boats because they knew that we were trading with the French and vice versa, the other way around. So basically, to avoid the entire issue, Thomas Jefferson put really that entire sector of Europe in an embargo. So he says we're not going to trade with any of them. But the problem that has is that it creates an entire like economic downfall and economic depression that happens in the United States. So it has a lot of impact on us directly. Yes. Scrolling up. Oh, sorry. Yeah. We good? Can you see it better? If it's difficult to see, like I can zoom in, but I can like move it over. It's tough. Yeah, I know it's tough because like the room is massive. That's the problem, and like this is probably the biggest screen in the building, but they used to have like the bigger one. Yeah.
What was the embargo?
Well, the embargo is basically us like not trading with Europe. Like it stops us trading altogether with Europe. The problem with that, though, is because of the fact that our main trade partners are France and Britain, right? And even the rest of Europe, too. If you place an embargo or preventing us from trading with them, then that is a problem that we have to deal with. And we don't get as much money going into the country. Now, obviously, when he leaves as president, the next president is Madison, his former Secretary of State. Now, when you look at what his actions are, he realizes the embargo was really not a good function. And so he does is he passes what they call the Non-Intercourse Act, which ends the embargo, but also passes what they call Macon's Bill, right? Macon's Bill just means that instead of being an embargo on the entirety of Europe, it's almost like a embargo on France and Britain. Only if they are peaceful with us will we continue to trade with them. So like you mess with us, we stop trade with you. If you don't mess with us, we will trade with you. That's basically his answer to what Thomas Jefferson had done. Go ahead, Anderson.
Right. So he stopped the trade with the French, even though it's beneficial for the US.
Yeah, so basically, so what he does first is the Non-Intercourse Act basically lifts the embargo and only restricts it to Britain and France. And then he says, well, we can now change it with the Macon's Bill, which basically makes it like, if you play nice with us, if you don't attack our boats, we'll trade with you, right? Then like, because he realizes that those two nations are the most connected trade partners to us. So like, as much as he's trying to do the right thing by saying, well, we need to answer for what they're doing with impressment. So we're going to place an embargo on them. But as time goes on, he's like, well, you know what? Enough time has passed. We'll give you a chance. If you don't mess with us, then we're fine. But if you continue doing impressment, we won't trade with you. Because both of them need resources, right? They need trade. So that's part of the problem. Okay. Now, the next portion kind of talks about really the prequel to the War of 1812. There are a lot of different things that happen that kind of get us to the war. As you can tell, I'm condensing the amount of words you have to write because I don't want you to have to keep writing a lot. The first thing to keep in mind for leading up to the war was impressment was still going on. So even though we had tried to make the Macon Bill and all the embargoes, all that stuff didn't really amount to anything. The impressment still went on between both countries. Now, the thing is, Madison is a Democratic Republican, and most of Congress was also Democratic Republican. So they favored France over Britain. So that's why a lot of people were criticizing Britain's actions more often than they were French, right? Because they had more favoritism towards one side or the other. But what was also going on in the country at the time was multiple different things. The first thing was a new formation of the Western Confederacy. We talked about the Northwest Confederacy early on in Unit 3, and that was one action that happened. But the Western Confederacy is basically a collection of more Native American tribes had kind of joined together to face off against Western expansion. Now, they are led by Tecumseh. They were given weaponry and resources by the British. Remember, one of the key components of Jefferson's early time period, as well as even Adams, was that the British had said they will not leave the forts in the Ohio Valley until they are repaid for all the debt that we had collected against them. And we never got to deal with that debt, so they never left the Ohio Valley forts that they created a long time ago. So one of the things that we found out was that the British were funneling weapons to the Western Confederacy to combat against us, because in the long run, they wanted to regain us as a colony. Okay. Now, obviously, the fact that they never left was another major issue. But because when we found out that they were funneling weapons to the Western Confederacy, younger politicians in Congress started to really make a name for themselves and become openly against the British and wanting war. They were known as the War Hawks. Okay. Now, some politicians, you will definitely obviously know the names at this point, but people like Henry Clay, people like John C. Calhoun, they were young politicians at this point in time, but they will have such massive impact on the country for many years to come, right? Yes.
How did Henry Clay have so much impact even though he didn't become president?
Well, that's the thing. He never wins the presidency, but he was so influential in Congress, right? He was like, I mean, other than this past election, like with President Biden, like before this point, he's run for office multiple times and never got the win. And he was a big component in Congress for a long period of time. And now just recently did he win, right? That's the thing. Like he ran for president several times before. And he was always influential in the Senate. Like that's where like a lot of his like campaign speeches were about like, oh, I know the Senate. I used to be there for like 30 plus years. Like, because he's not wrong. He was in the Senate for a long time. So it's like that. Sometimes people just don't win because it's just not the right time, you know? So that's just how it happens. Okay, any questions on the prelude to the war? We're okay? All right, so let's get to the next part, the war itself. Yeah. What's up? Basically a war hawk is like, think about a young politician who is like gunning for war. They want conflict. They want to challenge the British for everything they're doing. They're more emotionally driven. That's what a lot of these guys are doing. They're just like, so like, we want war. They were more supportive of that conflict. Okay. All right, listen, we're almost there. So, War of 1812. Key thing to keep in mind, the first point, guys, was most of the war, when it comes to the war itself, was pretty much a stalemate, okay? Most of the war was a stalemate. Now, the only moments in time where things really happened or changed was when the British gained the advantage when they attacked Washington, D.C. They burnt down the White House. Some stories about like Dolly Madison was able to save like George Washington's painting because it shows you like how much symbolicism that like some of these things were. And we ended up winning in the Battle of Baltimore, which was also known as the Battle of Fort McHenry, which kind of prevented the British from advancing even further and basically winning the entire thing. In the South, a lot of people like, you know, specifically like Andrew Jackson became most known for winning major battles in the South. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend basically stops the Western Confederacy, kind of destroys the Western Confederacy from ever growing ever again, and also wins the Battle of New Orleans, which is considered to be the final battle post like the negotiation process of the end of the war. Now, what the effects overall that this war has, when you think about it, there's a few things that I mentioned here. Firstly, and I think so, a lot of people kind of remember this back when we did the context activity like the last few weeks. But the Hartford Convention was created by Federalist Party because the war was actually lasting a lot longer than what most people expected. They kind of formed a committee or convention in Connecticut to discuss possibly seceding from the country. And they used the ultimatum that if the war does not end, then we will secede and leave the country as a whole. Very soon after this convention, though, before they even made the announcement, the war ended. So they looked pretty stupid to the public when they were saying, this war doesn't end, we'll leave. And then the war literally ends. And they're like, wow, everyone turned to them and said, wow, you literally were this close to leaving the country and not just waiting. And a lot of the Federalist Party lost their entire popularity and they eventually collapsed very soon after this. Secondly, the fact that this was a second war for independence, it kind of was like the final attempt by Britain to ever gain us as a colony again. And from here on out, Britain actually becomes one of our strongest allies because of just trade connections and things like that. It was kind of a very interesting turn of events. But a lot of people look at this moment as a sense of nationalism is now embedded with the country. Because very, very not often do you see a country win against Britain but beat them twice in a 30-year span, right? And that's a pretty big deal. And so we gain a lot of nationalism behind ourselves, and that's what kind of pushes a lot of presence, kind of like future decades to kind of see that new engulfed nationalism and support within the country. Okay. Questions on the War of 1812? Yes, go ahead, Phil. Battle of New Orleans. It was just basically, it was the final battle of the entire war. What you should know though is that a lot of the key effects from this war result in a lot of like war heroes, people that were considered to be like national figures, broke from this conflict. So, for example, Henry Clay, he was a war hawk, but he was big part of the negotiations of the final of the final treaty. Same thing with John Quincy Adams, right? He was a key minister, a diplomat for the end of the war. Andrew Jackson was a general that won multiple battles, was very popular at the end of the war. All three of those people I just mentioned become political candidates for a presidency, right? So that's why it shows you how much they did kind of respect them. Now, Monroe as president, okay, big thing for him is obviously he is the president during the era of good feelings, okay? The era of good feeling lasts for roughly 3 years. It ends with the Panic of 1819, and mainly this shows you how nationalism was growing. Most younger Americans became more involved in politics and they become part of the reason why he was elected president. And they have such a confidence within themselves because of the war. This starts a wave of nationalism, and a lot of times we even point to even economic nationalism. Henry Clay proposes the concept known as American system, okay? It's hard to kind of understand what the system is if you don't know like the details of it, but it's basically an economic system. It's an idea that you want to promote protective tariffs to boost your smaller businesses. So like, remember, tariffs are a tax on imported goods, meaning that any goods from Europe or any other place will be taxed well enough that people would be more incentivized to buy American-made goods instead. Secondly, they want to revitalize the bank, expand it for a longer amount of years, because he's a big believer of the bank. And thirdly, to improve internal functions or infrastructure. So things like the road systems, create an entire road system so that people can travel a lot easier around the country, advanced canals, right? Things along those lines, right? He wants to expand manufacturing and trade as the main reason why the country makes wealth. That's what the American system is promoting. Now, what's important though is that even though these new functions and these new policies are put into place, the end of the era of good feelings is going to be the Panic of 1819. Now, what is the reason why for this entire debacle to happen is because partly due to the National Bank giving out way too many loans to people. Basically, it was like that domino effect. The National Bank was giving out loans to state banks. State banks then took those loans and started to invest in loans for people. The problem is that if you invest too many loans to people who can't pay back the money, then all of a sudden when the National Bank needs some money back because the entire economy is struggling, then they're gonna ask the states, hey, give us some more money back, we need it at a faster rate, or interest is gonna go up. State banks say, all right, people, we're gonna increase the interest rate, you gotta speed up your process of paying back, and all those people can't pay back the bill. It's a chain reaction event. Multiple people start losing out on all the money they invested in. They all their loans get kind of squashed, and this is a problem ultimately because of the national bank. So because of this problem, people started to challenge the bank more often. Specifically, the Supreme Court case known as McCullough versus Maryland is an example of that. Because of this distaste for the national bank in Maryland, okay, specifically in Baltimore, one charter of a national bank was challenged. They placed massive taxes on the bank. They said you need to pay the tax. The head of the charter, McCullough, says, no, I'm not paying your tax. It gets to the Supreme Court, and they rule that in order, you cannot tax a federal institution, as in it creates the concept known as federal supremacy. Okay, what this basically means is that the federal government institutions or laws in general are more supreme than state institutions. So that means that a state cannot tax a federal bank because it is a federal bank, right? You can tax state institutions because in your state, but even if it's located in your state, doesn't mean you have the right to tax it. Same thing with laws, okay? If a federal law is passed, it is supreme to others, right? That's the point, okay? Questions there? Am I going too fast for anybody? All right, good, okay. Let's go down. Now, as time goes on, during Monroe's time, Western expansion is going on, okay? Now, the biggest thing is that we see an increasing of immigrants, which means people are funneling into the country. They are basically going to try to, becoming more spread out throughout the entirety of the country and try to funnel into new territories. Now, one of the issues that people have is a split between free and slave states. It is equal at this point, and one of the first things that has to happen is addition of new states. When they start applying for statehood, this could break that balance. So the first thing that happens is the Missouri Compromise. The overall guidelines of this was that it would add Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and create kind of a future precedent for future states going forward. The 3630 line states that anything above it, all the way to the west, would be a free, anything below it would be a slave state. That's kind of the first compromise we see between this entire issue. As you can tell, like this is something that will be a trend going forward. Slave states versus free states. That's sectionalism. Yes. It takes a lot longer for that to happen. But yes, like think about because remember, there's the Compromise of 1850 that happens later on, and that the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Like there's many different acts and laws that are passed after this point that kind of show the differences. Okay. Now, some of the things that he does foreign policy-wise, okay? I kind of make a quick version of them here for you. A lot of these expansions that people saw with like people going out west did cause a lot of disputes to happen with other countries. Specifically, think about Oregon. We make a joint occupation of Oregon between us and the British. Nothing too bad there. In Florida, we start to expand because of the fact that, like, specifically, like the Seminoles and other tribes were attacking us on the border, right? So Andrew Jackson, like he always does, goes ahead of what people tell him to do and just takes Florida without the government's permission to do so. He goes back. Spain realizes that it's actually, like you can't really just take it. So he says, well, we'll make a trade exchange and you can take Florida. So it doesn't look like they get nothing for the whole deal. So they do. We end up buying Florida. We end up having the Seminole Wars against them, against obviously the tribe in Florida that was controlling most of it. We end up winning it and gaining Florida. But the biggest thing that Monroe does, and I think this is super important, especially in the context of like imperialism, is the Monroe Doctrine. Okay. Now, the Monroe Doctrine in the long run doesn't necessarily make massive impact right away. But the whole concept of the Monroe Doctrine was that he was trying to make a statement that he does not want any European powers to colonize anything in the Western Hemisphere ever again. And any nation that does do that will be seen as a threat to the United States. He only made this claim because the British did have our backs, but we also told the British the same thing. We do not want you to step in this side of the world and try to colonize again. They were a little like, sure, I guess. But at the time, the United States was not strong enough to enforce this policy. So this is a good kind of sense to remember that this sets up Roosevelt and his actions and with the Roosevelt colony. Okay. This is way before Roosevelt, but it does kind of give you a sense of what they used it as a foreign policy decision. Right. It's kind of interesting because really at the time it didn't do anything, but way later on, it has a big deal. Okay. Okay. We're almost done with this. I know we might go a little bit over. Sorry, I'm a little bit over just because I want to like finish unit 4 for you. I think this is actually no, it's not. Oh, geez. Okay. We all right? No? Is everything okay? We're good? Okay. Is it if you have to leave early, it's okay. I'm recording this. So you have to leave at 12. That's fine. Just give me a head. Just if you don't have to stop at anything. Just if you have to go, you have to go. I'm recording this for your benefit. Okay. All right. So next part. So next part, we have industrialization. So when we did industrialization, we had an entire project. Each of you analyzed a different innovation. You all broke it down. You all did your presentations in class. Now, I kind of narrowed it down for you. I shortened the amount of writing you have to do because I could tell that you're already hurting at this point. But industrialization can be seen a lot of new innovations that are coming about because of this, right? Think about, like, give you different categories. Transportation. The railroads are obviously going to be super impactful. New types of canals like the Erie Canal, steamboats. All of these are obviously going to help with transportation. When it comes into like factories and manufacturing, think about the factory system as a whole. Interchangeable parts, right? These are all going to be helping with manufacturing a lot easier. Think about commercial agriculture. Like think about innovations that help with farming. The cotton gin is the most important thing that you should definitely know what that is, what the impact is. Because of developing cotton so fast and how easy it is now, it only increases slavery to become bigger, right? Because now you can process, cotton a lot faster than it used to be. Other examples like the mechanical reaper and the steel plow, all are good examples of how making farming a lot easier if you can buy these products. Now, some of the impacts or effects, and I kind of listed them at the next page. No. So I'll wait a moment just because, of course, the page is on the effects are on the next page. It's a little bit over.
That's it.
Yep.
I'm really so hungry.
Yeah. We're not going to be past 12:30. Yeah, because we only have like one more page after this one, so we'll be done. Soon. Yeah, that's fine. All right, we go with this page. Good. All right. So the effects. So listen, look, we're almost there. All right. So what are the effects of this market revolution? A few things happen. Okay. In the north, guys, I know we're almost done. The north, a lot of industry is now created. Manufacturing becomes so important, right? That all of a sudden you see how immigration will start to increase because they want to get jobs in the north. The wealth of these industry leaders will start to get bigger and bigger. They don't get to the levels of like monopolies yet. That takes a lot more time, but obviously industry in the north becomes such a big deal. In the south, things like the cotton gin, mechanical reaper, steel plow really revitalize farming industry as a whole. Slavery becomes such an important concept, and cotton becomes the most important crop in the South for all the way past the Civil War, because that entire concept of using cotton to then sell to not only the northern industries like in textile mills in the north or even to Britain is the main reason why wealth is going through the South. So that's why it's super important there. In the West becomes the hub of new industries because it's so wide open that you can now start to try to create new businesses out there. Now, what we do also see is like after all the market revolutions are already going on, we see a new era known as the age of the common man or the Jacksonian era. Okay, this is the other most used topic for like DBQs or LEQs especially for this unit. Okay, because Jackson is a very interesting character with a lot of different things happening because of him. So when you think about this era, okay, when you think about this era as a whole, right? The reason why it's called the era of the common man is because during this time, most people started to become more educated, plus the suffrage for white males started to become more expanded upon. It used to always be you have to own a specific number of acreage of land to vote, but they started to lower that so that more people can vote in elections. So that means that common people were voting more often. And obviously, like I said, people more educated, people started to learn more, and that means that you can now like be more involved. And the concepts like a self-made man started to become such a priority, and how people looked and what they respected. Okay. And that was part of what like an early American culture was. Now, when you look at the election of 1824, this shows you the battle up close and personal. The 4 people that are put forward here, 3 of them were heroes or most known figures of the War of 1812, with Henry Clay, with Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and William Crawford's kind of the odd man out of the bunch. Okay. Now, overall, the result of this election, I'll go down a little bit. The result of this election was that Jackson won the popular votes, but did not win the electoral, and he did not win the majority of it. So it went to a special election where the House of Representatives had to make a pick on who they wanted as president. Now, who they picked was seen as very corrupt, because Henry Clay was kicked out of the race at this point, and he was the Speaker of the House for the House of Representatives. He had massive influence over that entire section. So he influenced them to vote for Clay. In exchange, he would be Clay's Secretary of State. This was known as the corrupt bargain. Okay. So that's what that moment in history is called, the corrupt bargain. Now, obviously, this is super important because it kind of sets up a lot of what Jackson's campaign speeches are going to be about, talking about how corrupt the country is and how basically it's a country led by elites. Okay. And with that being the case, when people start seeing that on a daily basis, they start to get really upset and say, everything that Adams does is going to be overshadowed by this moment. So even if John Quincy Adams does right things, like does things that help the country, it doesn't matter. It eventually basically will hurt him in the long run. Okay. Scroll down a little bit. Okay. So when you look about John Quincy Adams, a lot of the policies he does emphasizes things like the American system, because Henry Clay and him were on the same page. He basically expands trade, uses the expansion of the tariff system as well as a road system. So the things he does really aren't that bad. But the tariff that he promotes is going to be shot down and targeted, and that's the tariff of abominations. Remember, John C. Calhoun, who was a supporter of Andrew Jackson, coined the phrase tariff of abominations because he was trying to talk about how bad it is for the South, but also kind of throw more political shade at it, because he realizes that this is obviously not good for Southern states. Now, because of this, because of a lot of the emphasis on corruption, Andrew Jackson wins the next election. So election of 1928. And when he becomes president, he becomes like, he's known as a self-made man. He sees that as a common person, but he's also going to be a president during a time where a lot of messed up things are going on. Okay. So let's take a look at some of the things. I listed the things here for you, and I put a little bullet underneath to give you an emphasis or explanation on some things as an example. Okay. So the 5 key things that happen are the main bullets here: spoil system, Peggy Eden affair, Indian Removal Act, nullification crisis, and the Battle of the National Bank. We had a whole activity that focused on the 5 things. That was like that was our big thing we did with Andrew Jackson. Okay. Underneath, I did provide a little bit more details for you. Like, for example, spoil system, like, is just think about like removing government officials and replacing them with just like people that were his supporters, and they didn't know what they were doing. They were dumb. So they started to be very corrupt and make bad actions. The Peggy Eden affair was more about like the battle between the wives of the different parts of the cabinet. So it was mainly showing how Jackson couldn't even kind of subdue an issue that was so minor that escalated to him firing the entire cabinet over, right? The Indian Removal Act is obviously a big deal. Think about the Trail of Tears. Basically, the Cherokee had fought in court that they should not be removed. They created their own constitution mirroring the U.S. Constitution. The first case, the state of Georgia had declared, or the Supreme Court declared, that they were not a a foreign entity, so they can't be like they can't make their own rights, like say that they can't be removed. But the second case that they appealed to said that they don't have to be forcibly removed. Jackson looks away, basically forces all the Native American tribes in that region to be removed entirely, which leads to the Trail of Tears. Nullification crisis. At this point in time, certain tariffs were passed. And basically, a lot of the southern states were fighting against it, specifically South Carolina with John C. Calhoun. This whole incident of the nullification crisis basically is averted because Jackson is able to create a compromise between the federal government and the southern states. And this is seen as a positive from his point of view. And the last one is the National Bank. He was a fierce opponent of the National Bank as a whole. He basically thought that, it was corrupt, that Biddle, who was the head of the bank, was using all the funds for his own benefit. And so when he starts to, when he gets voted, reelected back as president, he basically takes all the funding from the national banks and funnels it into state banks, or also known as pet banks. This really causes a lot of problems, especially for the later president, which is going to be Martin Van Buren. Okay. We're literally at the end here, so do bear with me. We're literally at the end. Okay. So Martin Van Buren, the only thing you need to know about him is because of the pet banks and the entirety of all the funds for the National Bank is being taken out, it leads to the Panic of 1837. The entirety of Van Buren's presidency was engulfed behind that issue. And basically during this, even after he loses this re-election campaign, Harrison and Tyler, like Harrison gets elected as president. But he dies of pneumonia a month after he's elected because during his inauguration speech, he was out in the cold too long and he dies of pneumonia. Few weeks later, Tyler's elected president. He was a Whig candidate, but he really did nothing, and a lot of people were angry that he basically vetoed a lot of the policies that the Whigs wanted. Okay, we're going to stop very soon. This is the last thing right here. Okay. Actually, is it? No, it's not. Jeez. Oh my god. Bro. Trust me, I typed this whole thing. So yes. I'll stay here and record and you'll see the rest of the tape anyway. So okay. This will be the last part because of 1211. So this era before the Civil War is known as the antebellum era. Okay. Now, the key thing to keep in mind about this is that during this time, there were groupings of people that were really trying to change a lot of issues that were going on. And I give you a list of different topics that will be brought up because a lot of the problems that we see, or a lot of the kind of the movements that we see, are led by what they call the Second Great Awakening. Okay. Now, actually, yeah, the last page is actually right after this. It's only the top portion. I was going to say, I don't think it's that long. Okay. We'll actually finish it before we're leave today. Now, these are all different lists of things that are going to be targeted, thinking about like the abolitionist movement, the temperance movement, changing for public asylums or public institutions, and obviously when it comes to women's suffrage. All of these things are going to be basically targeted or kind of brought to the fold due to the Second Great Awakening, okay? So when it comes to the Second Great Awakening, okay, I'll talk to you briefly about what it is. You should know it is a key movement that is really important to emphasize and understand because it does change a lot of things in society, okay? When it comes to the Second Great Awakening, it is similar to the First Great Awakening, but it also has some major differences, okay? If the First Great Awakening was bringing you back to faith and using your emotion to connect you to other people, their main goal was to change the individual. To say, we need to change you individually, you to act better morally, and then society as a whole will change for the better. The Second Great Awakening, okay, the Second Great Awakening says the same base concepts of bringing you back to religion, but instead of changing the individual, we need to change society, okay? We need to change society. Now, the Second Great Awakening causes a lot of different things to happen, a lot of effects, okay? It makes a lot of people become more connected emotionally to each other, but also to think morally of what institutions need to be fixed. And that list of things you just wrote down are all examples of things that people saw that were a problem. and like temperance and women's rights and abolition. All of these different things were seen as major morally wrong things. So they need to fix them. And it was because of the Second Great Awakening. Now, other effects are going to be temperance, like alcohol consumption. So other effects, new sub-religions do emerge, like Baptist Church, Methodist Church, Mormons, like all these sub-religions do form because it encourages people to not just be connected to each other, but to also think for yourself. And it like says, hey, listen, as much as preachers have insight on religion, at this point, people are more educated. So they're like, hey, you can read the Bible and come up with your own feelings about what it tells you. And that's why a lot of people started to make their own religions because of that mindset. But it also creates a concept where people want to create a utopia of where they think a perfect society would be. Where in the two examples we talked about in class were the Shakers, who obviously were like so emotionally driven by a religion that they would shake with the Holy Spirit running through their body. And they believe that no one should have any social, emotional connection to anyone else other than to God. So that means they can't have any family, they can't have kids. The Oneida community is the opposite. Instead of you being restricted, you be more open to everyone. So everyone shares family, everyone shares wives, everyone shares kids, everything. Right? That's the opposite. And that's it for Unit 4. I got you.
My head is on fire.
This recording will be available for you online.
Like that, like